Well, while she's setting this up, I want to thank David for inviting me. Been looking forward to this. Really appreciated Steve Arlington's talk. I think he framed the situation very, very well. What I'm going to try to do is give you what may be at least a part of a solution to what he was talking about in terms of building an ecosystem, if you will, of shared value. By the way, I didn't coin that term. That's a term developed by Mark Kramer and Mark Pfizer from the Harvard Business School. I'd suggest you look it up because I think what they're describing is this collaborative relationships of multiple stakeholders building resources that no one company can build, no one stakeholder can build for the value of society. And I think that's where we are in R&D for pharma. So collaborations and then building for pharma. Let's see, this is not the beginning. So as you heard Dave mention, we formed about 3 years ago an alliance of cancer centers throughout the United States called ORIEN. Stands for Oncology Research Information Exchange Network. For all the astronomers in the room, I recognize I misspelled Orion, but I could not make exchange out of an O, so that's where we are. So what I'm going to describe, though, is this, hopefully, what could be classified as an ecosystem of shared value, coming together multiple stakeholders to build something that we believe society needs. So this is the current membership. It is fully national, if you will, coast to coast. I think you recognize probably all of the members. They're quite well known. This started, by the way, with a partnership between Ohio State, the James Cancer Center, and Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. And we knew we wanted to do this. We knew we wanted to build it. And Mike, the center director at Ohio State, I was center director at Moffitt at the time, knew we were going to do this. It took us 2.5 years to figure it out. How could we bring together multiple cancer centers as an alliance, basically to share data, and then by creating data, and then collaborate using that data. I'll just point out the active military is part of this effort. What you see there is the Howard M. Jackson Cancer Center. That's Murtha. That is the Walter Reed Medical Center. And so the entire active military is part of this alliance. And we're talking to the VA as we speak. So here's some of the guiding principles for ORIEN. Inclusiveness. If you think you're creating something of value, you should do your best to include as many stakeholders and interested parties as you can. Accessibility. What we believe we're building is a patient-centric effort. We think there's value. Our primary stakeholder is the patient themselves. So we need to create something that is accessible. Not all patients can travel to Ohio State, Rutgers, Moffitt. We should take what we're building and export it to where the patient lives. And so that's in earnest, accessibility. You just heard Steve talk about private-public partnerships. Absolutely critical. We cannot do this alone. We can't do it in a siloed fashion of academia here, industry here, advocacy groups over there. It has to be a coalition of stakeholders that come together and create these partnerships, and then ultimately collaboration. So those are the 4 primary guiding principles, if you will, of ORIEN. Now, here's the backbone of ORIEN. It's called Total Cancer Care. It's something we developed at Moffitt almost 15 years ago. And the idea was, what if we could follow every patient that came through our doors? What if we could follow them, learn from them, and then actually create a system that, from that learning, change the way we practice? That was the concept. It took us a long time to figure it out. And I see David Finstermacher here from MedImmune. He was one of the, at that time, helping us build this. And the idea, again, was identify patient need, develop a system to meet that need based on evidence, and if you're really good, develop markers to predict needs so you might actually intervene before the need manifests. That's total cancer care. Now, what this is it's a partnership with patients. We ask them, when they come to these ORIEN centers, if you will donate all your medical data from any source throughout your lifetime to the center you're a part of, or whoever's taking care of you. Will you donate tissue in excess of what's needed for your primary care so that we can study it using molecular analyses? And by the way, it's a blanket, if you will. molecular analyses. They do not want us contacting them every time we want to test their tissue. Just do it, is what the patients have told us. If you find something that might benefit me, contact me, which was the third principle of total cancer care. We have the right of recontact. We can ask the patient how they're doing, get patient self-reported data, and we can tell them, by the way, we found something in your disease that may be of value and matching you to a clinical trial. So you need patient's permission to do that. And that's what the protocol and consent does. So it is a truly patient-oriented and partnership. The protocol is entering its 12th year. We've enrolled, this slide's actually a little dated, over 200,000 patients who have consented to be followed throughout their lifetime, donating their clinical data and tissue. I will tell you the rate-limiting step is, in fact, our ability to consent. When we do consent, it's over 90% say, yes, you may do this. But what we're working on now is internet consent, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The way we're doing it currently, it's face-to-face, a consenter going asking the patient, here's what we're doing, you want to read this protocol, it's 20, oh, by the way, the consent's 20 pages. We at least learned through the patient advocacy group that is helping us, is stop giving us 20 pages to read. So we created a 6-minute video, and they watch it on the internet and can download and consent through the internet. So the evolution of this protocol has moved forward, I'm pleased to say, and it has now been approved by over 35 IRBs in over 20 states. So it's passed the test of time in terms of regulation and things that you need to meet in terms of common rule, things like that, in terms of patients' use of their data and tissue. Now, we are getting many, many sources of data, some from the electronic medical records, some from the laboratory, some from the actual analyses you're performing on these tissues, and patient self-reported data. Actually, at last count, I think it was about 14 primary sources of data. So all of which have different data dictionaries, different definitions of data elements. So it needed to be harmonized, and we did this some years ago, so we used just help me out here, David. Which one did we use? Informatica as the primary source for creating a common data dictionary across all these primary sources. And then it was put in a SQL relational data warehouse, Oracle. Now that served Moffitt and its partners. Wasn't nearly big enough for ORIEN, which now has 17 members and growing. So we went to the cloud, so to speak. But let me describe, you heard I was the founder and running M2Gen. So what is M2Gen? How does it fit ORIEN? And what's its role in bringing these stakeholders together? In 2006, Moffitt formed a partnership with Merck. We were looking for someone to help us build this. And Merck contributed both financially and in kind, covered all the cost of all the molecular assays being performed. And they only asked this. They asked for a period of exclusivity for 5 years to mine the data for discovery. They fortunately asked us, what do you think you need? And we said, if Pfizer comes to us and says, we have this new drug, we'd like to know how many patients in the database have consented who fit the clinical criteria to come into a trial and express the marker of interest. And when I explained this to then the leader of Merck, that we were going to use their data to match a patient to a Pfizer's trial, you can imagine the expression I got. But it took him about 10 seconds, and he said, you're right. That created the pre-competitive space so that now every pharma we work with, when they generate molecular data and clinical data, that data can be used to the patient's benefit to be matched to anybody's trial. That was critical. We affectionately call it the Merck rule. And we're working with about 14 pharma. Every one of them have adopted and accepted that rule. So there is the environment of pre-competitive space and collaboration, especially when it benefits the patient. So critical. So what M2Gen does is we are the, if you will, the engine for ORIEN. We interface between pharma and the academic centers, and we build the infrastructure for generating data. We create the contracts for generation of the molecular data, by the way, which is all standardized. We work with, as you'll see, DNAnexus for hosting this data and analyzing this data and distributing the data, and different APIs and interfaces. M2Gen does all that. An academic center can do it for themselves, but that's it. And so you needed an engine that can interface between the commercial and the not-for-profit academics. That's M2Gen's role. We have been working with numerous pharma, as I mentioned. Again, we are building a data warehouse that is following patients from time of diagnosis through ultimate outcome, throughout their life. We're constantly generating data. The data is updated, so it is truly longitudinal. So it can be, we believe, data that can serve multiple dimensions of R&D and ultimately, hopefully, at the point of care. Here you can see examples of use of the data from discovery to design of clinical trials and clinical trial matching, and then post-market surveillance. I'll give you an example of the post-market surveillance. And all of this is published, by the way. Pharma wants to publish this with our academic partners. This is a good thing. Get it out there. The post-market surveillance example was Celgene, obviously with the drug Revlimid for MDS and myeloma. That's their primary drug. A study in Italy, a small study, thought, or at least showed some data that suggested that Revlimid was increasing secondary malignancies, leukemia, for treatment of MDS and myeloma. You can imagine that got the attention of both Celgene and the FDA. Problem was they didn't have a database of longitudinal patients to actually validate it, but they heard about us. We had about 10 times the number of patients in myeloma that was used to make the original observation, and in fact we demonstrated there was no increase in risk of secondary malignancies with the use of Revlimid. So you can imagine the delight both of FDA patients on this drug, et cetera. But that's an example of how using real-world evidence. These were patients, again, who had been on the drug for years, and providing the evidence we need to decide which therapy, and the longitudinal follow-up is absolutely critical when you're starting to look at long-term benefit or risk. So these are the, I will classify as the primary goals of ORIEN. Number one, use data science to accelerate this entire dimension of R&D, but also delivery. We believe we're at a point where we can start anticipating need by creating what we call in silico communities. So looking at the degree of similarity of each patient and, if you will, assigning them to a cohort, patients like them. All right, and then follow those cohorts, again, longitudinally, and then starting asking questions of those cohorts. If you have patients that look very similar, both clinically and genetically, and then are treated with a given therapy, some of them will respond and some will not. Well, you just created two cohorts, responder, non-responder, to the same initial cohort. So this is an iterative process depending on the question you're asking. But the basis of practically everything we do now is to, if you will, examine the patient, assess the patient phenotypically and genotypically, and then assign them to their, what we call their avatar, patients that look like them. Now, a patient can reside in multiple avatars or in silico communities, depending on the question. If you're a sponsor of a trial or the primary investigator of a trial, and you want to know how many patients out there have the marker of interest and are at risk and who may become eligible for your trial, we can do that. So we create an avatar for that trial. How many patients meet the criteria clinically, have the marker, and are at risk. We follow them, and by the way, patients can be eligible for multiple trials. So from a patient's point of view, they know how many trials they might be eligible should it be necessary before they relapse. This is anticipation. And the title of the talk was Moving from Reactive to Proactive Medicine. This is what we're going to need to do. We need this kind of machinery, if you will, information to be able to do that. And the time to work a patient up for a clinical trial is not when they've already progressed. If you have gastric and pancreatic cancer and progressive disease on standard of therapy, your window is like that. And so you then send in the tissue, you then do the assay. 4 weeks later, you may get the results. What if it's negative? What do you do then? So what we're trying to do is anticipate. These populations at risk, let's run as many tests as we can, determine how many options they have, and so when the patient is in need, both the physician and patient already knew their options. And now it's the patient's and physician's choice, and that's how we do it. We don't dictate which trial they go on, we give them information. But it's going to take that kind of anticipatory capability, which we think is foundational, for this entire effort. And ultimately, you heard Stephen talk about evidence, I think, and then evidence can be determined and expressed as value. We're looking for value, which is outcome divided by cost. I mean, ultimately, that's what we're going to need to do. So again, here's the concept. Follow patients who have consented, generate data, both phenotypic and genotypic, and do this as and throughout their journey in dealing with cancer, and assign them to their avatar, learn from them, and then create multiple, if you will, subset in silico communities as we learn and ask questions. So this is just an ongoing process. So we started again with this effort of assigning patients to in silico communities. We'd love to do this for every patient ever diagnosed with cancer. We don't have the bandwidth or the money, frankly. Patients would like us to do it. So what we started with were high-risk patients, patients with stage 2, 3, 4 disease, the usual, gastric, pancreatic, patients that we probably are going to need a trial, at least 50% of them throughout their journey. So we decided, let's hone down on that. Those are the patients in greatest need. Those patients that are cured by standard therapy have issues as well that need to be addressed, but those that don't continue to do well on standard therapy and relapse need a trial. That's the community we started. So you can see through the inverted pyramid, we're going with high-risk patients first. And what we're doing is, again, following these patients through a very comprehensive molecular profiling, which I'll show in a minute, the clinical data, and then based on the information we have at that time, filtering it on all trials available. When we do this filter, it's looking at 4,000 trials throughout the United States and actually the nation, the world. And in now minutes, we can find the best trials for any given patient, starting with over 4,000 trials. We have that capability. And this is what we're providing to the physician, to the patient, and to our pharma partners. So the pharma industry is getting an idea of the prevalence of that population that fit the criteria that they're interested in. We can help them design, and through in silico means, what that clinical trial looks like. Often they go off and they have no clue what the prevalence is in different diseases. We can tell them, this is the way you need to design your trial. This is the population you're trying to serve. So in that process, frankly, the worst thing you do is do all that, create options, and then not have the infrastructure to actually activate the trial. So ORIEN members have come together to create a single IRB, single contract, single budget, single master agreement. It's still in, as you might imagine, we've done 3 out of the 4. The one we haven't quite accomplished is a single budget. Not surprising, right? But we've got to create efficiencies. Once we know what those options are, we have to act on them. We can't tell patients, well, we know the options for you, we just can't get the trial open. Can you imagine if you're a patient and you're hearing that? It won't go. So this is a continuum of effort that is required to make this happen. Now here's the type of molecular data we're generating across all 17 centers of patients enrolled in total cancer care who are deemed at risk. We're doing whole exome sequencing both on tumor and normal, 300x, 100x respectively. And then we'll show you the informatics platform that we've built. We also have what we call Tier 2. And you have to allow, if you will, you can never tell a cancer center you can't do that anymore. So Tier 2 is do your own thing, but give us the data when you do it. And so it's usually targeted exome sequencing or something like that. Very valuable, and usually in a CLIA environment. And then finally, proprietary. The companion diagnostics for a given trial can be tested before the patient needs it. So you're testing entire populations with that companion diagnostic. And you've already, and multiple companion diagnostics, not just one. You're not looking for one trial. You're looking for options that may be best fitting that patient. So you try to do as many, if you will, proprietary companion diagnostics as you can. Clinical data, given time, it's very comprehensive. We start with NASR data, the SEER approach, which is what the foundation is, if you will. It also creates a data standard across all 17 cancer centers, and then we elaborate, and all 17 centers are agreeing on data dictionaries. So that makes it a lot easier when you're sharing data to have the same data dictionary. This is our partnership that's critical. And again, we don't run the assays, and the members have agreed to use a common assay. So initially we're going, not initially, we are working with Hudson Alpha on the sequencing both RNA-seq as well as whole exome sequencing. And what we found is our volume is increasing such that we're going to be using multiple labs, but they're all agreeing to basically the same platform. So as we build this, we have to be considering scalability as well, which brings us to DNAnexus. After an RFC and RFP extensive review, we wound up working with DNAnexus. All of this is now cloud-based. As I initially told you, it was a relational data warehouse through Oracle. In order to accommodate multiple stakeholders, we needed a cloud-based system that was secure and accessible, but given whoever the stakeholder is, we can present the data in a certain format and virtually a virtual cloud for them, and then bring in data to compare. So you can see multiple facets of the ecosystem. This took us about 2 years to build. Thank you, 5 minutes. All right. All of you can see this. It's an integrated effort amongst multiple platforms to ultimately, what we hope to be able to do is that physician in Kissimmee, Florida, you know, Kissimmee it's about 50,000 people, great docs, but there's no cancer center there, so no molecular biologists. We think what we need to be able to do is the doc in Kissimmee who sees a patient with cancer, the patient consents, their data comes into the total cancer care database. They donate their tissue. We perform the molecular assays and then put that data into the data warehouse and then assign the patient to their avatar, their in silico community, and begin to create options for that patient. But at the point of care, what we could also be able to do at the time of diagnosis is the same doc that enrolled the patient can then ask, how many patients look like my patient that I saw today? There's the cohort. That's that patient's avatar. What was used to treat that community? The various therapies. What are the outcomes in each treatment? We should be able to do that. This is aspirational. This is what we're working toward. So that doc that enrolled the patient in Kissimmee now knows this is the community that that patient belongs to. These were the treatments used, and these are the outcomes. Then it's up to the doc and the patient to decide what they want to do, but they're doing so in an informed way. That's our ultimate goal. And because of time, I'm going to move on. As I mentioned, multiple dimensions. The research dimension is the most, if you will, mature. You can see we are focusing on immuno-oncology, looking at the various types of parameters, for example, mutation load, et cetera. We've actually formed signatures that we believe will predict and perhaps even direct the physician to the type of therapy that the patient may need. So again, because of time, I won't go into the entire platform and algorithms and APIs that we've built, but as you can imagine, it is quite comprehensive, but it is still based on how many patients you can put into this system. This is just an analysis of across all diseases. Not surprising, mutation load was high in melanoma and prostate cancer. Here's just a subset analysis of patients with breast cancer. Question was, what's the mutation load in breast cancer in ER positive versus ER negative? Not surprising, ER negative, it's higher. So it fits. And you can do these sort of analyses now in minutes. Okay, it's telling me I'm done. Okay, here, and I'll finish here. This is where we want to be. Since Hippocrates, medicine has been reactive. Patient comes in, patient says, I have pain, the doc reacts and tries to treat them. In cancer, once you've been diagnosed, you can't react. You got to be proactive. You got to anticipate. Who's going to have the greatest chance of relapse, and what are their options? Create as many options as you can before they relapse. That's the intent here. And provide this data to the point of care, to the physician who's taking care of that, and engage the patients themselves. So we have, as I mentioned, a patient advocacy group, fabulous group. This is one of the most engaged committees we have. I will tell you, I've never had to ask this committee, what do you think? They're going to tell us. And they guide us, and they've written if you will, white papers about what this avatar, this approach to anticipating needs from the patient point of view. They want to be engaged. The question then becomes, how do you tell them the information in a meaningful way? So we've still got work to do in that area. We are building the Total Cancer Care website. It's still in its alpha phase. If you went to the website and typed in oriontcc.org, that's what you're going to see. That's all you're going to see. So it's still in development. But the idea is to inform and educate the patient. They have access to their data, but in a means of, we're not telling them you have a BRAF V600E. We're telling them that this is your avatar, these are the changes we're seeing, this is what we're learning. That's what they want to know. So, again, patient-centric. It all starts with the patient, multiple stakeholders, but those stakeholders need to come together and build something that no one stakeholder can do. We think it's through information and then the interface and learning and helping at the point of care. So with that, I thank you very much.
All right. Wow, that was fantastic. And I think it may even be hard to appreciate just the extent of persistence and vision of starting this idea and and pulling it all together. And what I'm curious about is I can imagine that there were a certain amount of organizational challenges as well as the technological challenges. What was the most difficult? What has been the most difficult aspect? And the second question would be, what are you focused most on right now to have this continue to move forward?
Excellent question. So these cancer centers, and by the way, we are also going to the community at large. We started with cancer centers because they have the infrastructure to enroll patients in trials and things like that. However, we are going to the community at large as well. When we began ORIEN, everybody loved the precept, let's share data and collaborate. And then when you start talking about, well, you need to give us this data on these patients. Well, wait a minute. We haven't made all their discoveries yet on this data. But you also get, there are sensitivities, cultural sensitivities. The Native American population is very hesitant to see their data being used without them knowing it. So we need to be cognizant of the patient's desire of how this data is being used. And by the way, the consent outlines this is what we're doing with your data. But it takes, the system is a federated system. Actually, it's a hybrid between a federated and a central system. The centers don't just give us, a data dump. We start off with a limited data set. It's all de-identified. And so we get enough data for the realm of the possible. And when we do want to go to a particular project, we explain it to the various centers. They say we're in. Then we get the huge amount of data. So it's more of a data lake approach. You acquire data and harmonize data depending on the project you want to do. We don't try to do it across the board. And we found that's more efficient as well. So the long-winded answer is social.
And then the top thing you're focused on right now, what's keeping you up at night other than hurricanes?
Yeah. The molecular data is structured. I won't call it easy, but it's much more facile to work with. The clinical data, especially acquiring it from its primary source and harmonizing it with it, that...
Non-trivial?
Oh, yeah, far from it. That, in fact, everybody that I know that's in this effort finds that to be the bottleneck. Docs like to, some of them get quite caught up in the prose of how do they write a note. And finding the elements that you need can be a challenge. We have a grant on natural language processing. The PI is James Allen, who wrote the book literally for natural language, but he'd never been involved in healthcare. When we're 2 years into it, and he shakes his head and he says, "This is awful." So, just to give you an idea of where we are.
Let me take one. I know there's coffee coming up. Let's do one question, and then we'll all head into a break. Hang on. Wait a sec.
So I find it interesting. You're collecting longitudinal data from a behavioral perspective. You can identify behavioral risks, which allow you to do the predictive medicine. But you're not, at least not from what I saw on the internet, you're not collecting molecular longitudinal information.
We are.
You're looking at a single normal snapshot, and assuming that stays in a relative level of stasis. Is there any interest in extending the IRB to include longitudinal molecular profiling, to be able to do longitudinal analysis in that perspective, to be able to react before even the arise potentially, the coup de grace, down the line?
Excellent question. I appreciate your asking it, because the consent does allow us to collect longitudinal tissue to which we can do molecular analyses. That's already covered. The challenge is in the system, the tissue can only be derived in the standard of care. So in our system, you don't do a biopsy for the purpose of doing the research. You're using tissue in excess of what is needed for the care. Now, if you have hematologic malignancies like myeloma or leukemia, it's a bone marrow. We've got longitudinal data on almost every heme patient, okay? Because we are creating it. But the limitation is the fact that we're using tissue acquired in the standard of care. Now, if the doc does a biopsy at time of progression, we can have access to that and do our assays, okay? So it is designed to do exactly what you're saying, but if the doc decides it's progression, I don't need another biopsy, we can't mandate that they do it. But the consent allows us to do exactly what you're saying. We are doing it in a subset of patients who have the tissue derived.
And maybe as the technology advances to look at evaluate tumors, solid tumors from the peripheral blood, you'll have more opportunities.
Exactly. That's probably our next foray in generating data is ctDNA.
Yeah. All right, well, great talk, great morning. Get yourself some coffee. We've got a lot more coming up, and let's thank Bill.
Thank you.